Welcome to the lecture on George Pitcher's The Misfortunes of the Dead. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the question of whether the dead can be harmed, and further, whether, if it's possible for the dead to be harmed, if that possibility constitutes something like a notion of the harm of death or why death is bad for the one who dies. We have conflicting intuitions on the question of whether the dead can be harmed, on the question of whether an event that occurs after a person's death can count as a misfortune for him. On the one hand, we think that if the business Mrs. White established and was proud of in her lifetime should collapse in ruins soon after her death, that really can't be a disaster for her. She is beyond disasters of any kind. On the other hand, we cannot rest quite content there. We think that in some way we do not wholly understand, it would have been better for Mrs. White if her business had not failed so soon after her death. We feel positively sorry for her when the employees are laid off, the petition for bankruptcy is filed, the windows are boarded up. George Pitcher is a professor emeritus at Princeton University. His research interests and publications include work on the philosophy of perception, the philosophy of the early 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the philosophy of the Enlightenment philosopher George Berkeley. Since what we're discussing in this essay is an ethical issue that deals with how we ought to think about our own lives, it will help us in understanding this topic to understand a philosophical subdiscipline that deals with such questions. Practical ethics, also sometimes called applied ethics, is the subdiscipline of philosophical ethics that concerns itself with the moral properties and moral reasons surrounding specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs. The practical ethicist is primarily concerned with the moral properties possessed by specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs, but is not primarily concerned with the general ethical theory that determines these moral properties. So the difference between the practical ethicist and what's known as the normative ethicist is that the practical ethicist is concerned with, for some specific action, for example, abortion, whether abortion is right, wrong, good, bad, moral, or immoral, while the normative ethicist is concerned instead with overarching moral theories that might make sense of what it is that makes anything at all right, wrong, good, bad, moral, immoral. Some, although not all, of the questions that are asked by the practical ethicist are: what is the moral status of specific sorts of sexual activity? What is the moral status of abortion? How should we treat non-human animals? What are the right and wrong ways for a nation to conduct itself in war? What is the moral status of issues concerned in specifically race-related questions? What is the moral status of issues concerned in specifically gender-related questions? And finally, what makes our specific sorts of lives go well or go badly? We could extend this final question to what makes our specific sorts of deaths go well or go badly? And Pitcher's question that we're investigating here, whether the dead can be harmed, can be seen as a version of that question. Are there things that can happen in death that can affect us? In understanding practical ethics, it's important to contrast practical ethics with what's known as existentialism. There is an important philosophical distinction to be made between the philosophical subdisciplines of practical ethics and existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical and literary movement that began mainly in Germany and France in the late 19th century. Thinkers such as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre are among existentialism's most prominent figures. Existentialism requires a radically individualistic, although not generally self-centered or egoistic, methodology that's known as phenomenology. Existentialism is in many ways a philosophy of living, where living refers to the specific sort of thing that self-conscious rational creatures like you and I are up to. While practical ethics generally gives us guidelines for how to live in terms of being good human people, and thus could be considered a philosophy of living, practical ethics nearly always ignores or eschews a phenomenological, first-personal, subjective methodology and is more concerned with things like moral principles and properties than it is with individual experience. So the central distinction between practical ethics and existentialism, if we want to call them both philosophies of living, is that practical ethics is a third-personal, merely objective way of investigating living and life, while existentialism is a subjective, first-personal investigation into what it is to be the sorts of things that we are when we are living. Since we're talking about death here, it's important to get clear on the issue of death, what the concept of death signifies in this lecture. We aren't here concerned with metaphysical or religious questions concerning whether persons are more than merely their bodies, or whether there's some part of a person that could possibly persist beyond bodily death. These are interesting questions in their own right and are related to questions about death, but we shouldn't get them confused with our central topic here, which is death, the nature of death, and in this lecture, whether the dead can be harmed. Death, as we'll be using the term here, and as it's mostly used in the contemporary Anglo-American philosophical tradition, refers to permanent annihilation of the subject. So, if I die, then I'm gone. Note that this is a stipulative definition. We aren't trying to solve any metaphysical or religious or ethical questions by using the term in this way. Nothing will turn on using the term in this way. So if somebody thinks that after bodily death we still exist in some way, then that person thinks that bodily death isn't death in the way that we're using the term death in this lecture. Further, if somebody thinks that some part of us is immortal, then that person thinks that we never die in the sense that we're using the term death in this lecture. Thus, it's important to remember when we speak about death that we, in this lecture, are referring to one and only one very specific thing, namely, permanent annihilation of the subject being no more. In understanding death, it's also important to understand the distinction between three concepts: being dead, death, and dying. Those three concepts can be used imprecisely or equivocally, so if we want to do good philosophical work surrounding these concepts, if we want to develop or understand the issues that we're speaking about, it's important to use these concepts precisely. Here's what we'll mean by them in this lecture. Being dead is the state that one is in after one has died, after one's death. One is no longer around when they are dead. On the other hand, death, that's the instant when one dies, when one passes from being alive to being dead. However, this term death is also used to refer to the state of being dead, and in fact, death is generally used in this second sense. Context will almost always make clear how the concept is being used. Finally, dying is the process that's undergone by the living. that is a lead up to death. So, no dying person is dead. Of course, in a poetic sort of way, we're all dying since we are all growing closer to death upon our birth. Usually, however, this concept, dying, is used to refer to the final bits, however we want to define final bits, of a person's life while they are living. The question about whether death is bad can be divided into two sorts of questions, what we can call a philosophical question and an emotional or psychological question. Many, probably most people think that there's something bad about death. And it's not just that death makes the survivors, the people who don't die, sad. In fact, that relation runs in the opposite direction. People are sad when somebody dies because they think that death is bad. However, if death is actually bad, then we should be able to find some reason why death is bad. Or if we think that death is bad, then we should be able to determine why it is that we're justified in thinking that death is bad. Call this search for whatever it is that might make death bad, the philosophical question of the badness of death. One way to examine the philosophical question of the badness of death, and the way that's been most influential in the contemporary practical philosophical study of death, has been to look at the sorts of things that make other living human endeavors bad, and then to see whether death possesses any of those things, or at least things that are relevantly similar to those things. Three things that make human endeavors go bad. One, that somebody or some person or people are harmed. Two, there's a lack of some good thing that should otherwise be present. And three, someone or some people are deprived of something that would be better for them not to be deprived of. In this lecture specifically, we'll be looking at the notion of harm. If harm is something that's bad for living people, and harm can happen to the dead, then harm is something that's bad for dead people as well. The second way of asking the question about the badness of death is an emotional way of asking the question. In addition to, and perhaps largely independent of, that philosophical question concerning the badness of death, there's also this emotional or psychological question. Many, perhaps most people, have negative emotions about or concerning death, especially about their own death. These emotions are generally related to the emotions of fear and anxiety. The emotional question concerning the badness of death is this: are our negative emotions concerning death apt, appropriate, or instead are those emotions misguided or misplaced? Now, of course, emotions are less susceptible to reason and argumentation than our beliefs. However, we shouldn't think that good reasons can't offer us emotional comfort concerning something that we thought was bad, or even show us the way to feeling much less bad or even good about something that we previously had negative emotions with respect to. So we shouldn't say, why investigate the emotional question of death? We can't change our emotions anyway. We might not be able to change them directly, but if the bad feelings that we have with respect to death are based on a misunderstanding of death, then once we understand death correctly, that might make us feel much better about death. Let's turn now to Pitcher's central point in his article. Pitcher's ultimate thesis, the thing that he is arguing for in his article, is this: the dead can be harmed. Pitcher gets to this thesis that the dead can be harmed via an intermediary thesis that says that the dead can be wronged. Pitcher's methodology here is to show us that the dead can be wronged. To be wronged is a more general, perhaps more amorphous concept than the concept of being harmed. And once he has shown us that the dead can be wronged, he shows us very briefly that there's no relevant difference between being wronged and being harmed, and therefore, if the dead can be wronged, the dead can be harmed. We in this lecture will extend Pitcher's ultimate thesis to this. If the dead can be harmed, then being dead is a significant disadvantage for a person, and so is itself a further harm. That is, part of the badness of death, an answer to the philosophical question here, can be found in the fact that death can be a harm to the one who dies, in that the one who dies is significantly disadvantaged with respect to being harmed while dead. You'll notice that Pitcher's initial thesis isn't about whether death itself is bad, but just about whether bad things can happen to a person after that person has died. But we can turn Pitcher's thesis very quickly into a thesis about whether death itself is bad or whether death itself is a harm by noticing that if being dead puts somebody at a disadvantage with respect to being harmed, then death itself is a harm or a disadvantage. Since we'll be talking quite a bit about this concept of harm, what do we mean by this? Here's what Pitcher says. I shall construe harm or misfortune in the following more or less orthodox way. An event or state of affairs is a misfortune for someone or harms someone when it is contrary to one or more of that person's more important desires or interests. This very rough characterization could be endlessly refined, but I hope the intuitive idea is clear enough for our purposes. I think it does capture most of the cases that we would, upon reflection, consider to be cases of a person's being harmed or suffering a misfortune. For example, if a person swears out a warrant against me, falsely accusing me of murder, I am thereby harmed, provided I have the usual desires to be well thought of, to be able to pursue my normal life, to be calm and free from anxiety and anger, and so on. For the accusation works against these desires. So consider something that is one of your overall interests in life. Maybe being well liked, maybe achieving success, maybe getting your degree, maybe being happy. Pitcher's picture here is that you are harmed insofar as some event occurs that works actively against that interest on your part. Pitcher's overall argument for his thesis looks like this. There are certain events that can occur after a person's death that constitute an injustice to, betrayal of, slander of, etc., that person. If a person is treated unjustly, betrayed, slandered, etc., then that person is wronged. Thus, there are certain events that can occur after a person's death that wrong that person. And if there are certain events that can occur after a person's death that wrong that person, then the dead can be wronged. Thus, the dead can be wronged. But there is no relevant difference between wronging a person and harming a person. Therefore, the dead can be harmed. Now, some of the language that we're using here might seem a little strange, even if it is also somewhat intuitive. So before we go any further, let me give you a methodological caution. This is a caution that you should be aware of, that you should take into advisement when you're examining Pitcher's argument. Says Pitcher, if we allow our unfettered intuition to operate on certain examples, it becomes abundantly clear that we think the dead can indeed be wronged. Now, we might be a little worried when we read that from Pitcher, because he's saying that if we allow our unfettered intuition, so if we don't put any constraints on our intuition, then we'll come to his conclusion. But why shouldn't we put any constraints on our intuition? Doesn't our intuition sometimes tell us that things that are obviously false are true or well justified? Aren't we sometimes misled by an intuition that we don't put any constraints on? Well, oftentimes, if some thesis strikes us as odd, and if that thesis can be reformulated in some way, even if that way results in losing essential components of the thesis, instead of investigating the possible arguments in favor of that thesis, we simply reformulate the thesis and consider ourselves done with it. So watch out while you read what Pitcher is saying, while you listen to this lecture. Be careful not to simply reformulate Pitcher's thesis that the dead can be harmed into some other thesis that doesn't even capture the essential elements of that thesis, and then to say, oh, that must be what I thought all along. Pitcher really does want you to take seriously the thesis that the dead can be harmed. He'll give you good reason to believe it, and he'll try to respond to what he thinks is the central criticism to that thesis. So we should give Pitcher a fair and honest hearing. When we think that we should just reformulate some thesis that's initially plausible so that we don't have to deal with it, this is a misfiring, in fact, an overfiring of our drive to eliminate cognitive dissonance. However, we should also recognize that we have two other options, rather than just reformulating the thesis that seems a little bit odd. One, perhaps, whatever it is that is in conflict with the thesis that strikes us as odd is in fact itself false. So the fact that something strikes us as odd because it's out of line with something else we believe doesn't mean that the thesis that strikes us as odd is false. Maybe it's the other thing that we believe that is false. Or instead, perhaps our determination that the thesis in question is at odds with some other belief we already hold is in fact false. So maybe when we see something that strikes us as somewhat odd and we say, oh, it's striking us as odd because it's at odds with some other thing we believe, maybe we're wrong. Maybe it's not actually at odds with some other thing we believe, so we don't have to give up anything. The main reason why we will think that what Pitcher is saying is somewhat odd is because of an inconsistent triad that is lurking in the background. An inconsistent triad is a set of three sentences that can't all be true at the same time. When we initially examine this claim that Pitcher makes that the dead can be harmed, that claim is likely to strike us as bizarre, maybe even false. This initial reaction on our part can be attributed to thinking that the following three sentences constitute an inconsistent triad. First sentence, the dead don't exist. Second sentence, things that don't exist can't be harmed. And third sentence, the dead can be harmed. It really seems, when we look at 1, 2, and 3, like they can't all be true at the same time. If the dead don't exist, and things that don't exist can't be harmed, then how could it possibly be the case that the dead can be harmed? Or if the dead can be harmed, and things that don't exist can't be harmed, then how could it possibly be the case that the dead don't exist? Or, if the dead don't exist, but the dead can be harmed, then how could it possibly be the case that things that don't exist can't be harmed? Now, as good philosophers, what we'll want to see is whether 1, 2, and 3 actually is an inconsistent triad. Is there some way, without throwing out any of 1, 2, and 3, which all themselves seem somewhat plausible, to show that all three of these sentences can in fact be true at the same time? Is there some way to save the truth of all of 1, 2, and 3? Let's take a look at Pitcher's argumentative methodology in his essay. Number 1 of our apparently inconsistent triad, the claim that the dead don't exist, just follows from the definition of death that we're using in this essay and that practical philosophers are using when they discuss the badness of death. Death is just the permanent annihilation of the subject, so it seems that 1 has to be true by definition. The main motivation for Pitcher's claim that the dead can be harmed, and hence that the previous apparently inconsistent triad isn't actually inconsistent, is to provide a series of examples in which it seems clear that the dead have been wronged or harmed. That will serve as strong motivation for 3, the claim that the dead can be harmed. It's 2, then, that stands in need of some sort of analysis or reinterpretation or further elaboration, and that is exactly Pitcher's plan. Show how the dead can be harmed without claiming that it's a non-existent thing that can be harmed. Since 1 just follows from definitions, and since we won't be able to get to 2, making sense of the harm of the dead until we have some good reason to think that the dead can be harmed, let's look at Pitcher's motivating examples that the dead can be harmed. We'll look at 5 of them. Motivating example 1. Bill Brown promises his dying father that he will bury him in the family plot when he dies. Bill instead sells his father's corpse to a medical school for dissection by students. Our intuition tells us that Mr. Brown has been badly betrayed by his son. Motivating example 2. In the Olympic Games 5 years ago, End won the mile run and received the gold medal. He has since died. Now, an international panel of corrupt judges, all of whom hated End, falsely charge that he committed a foul on the 3rd lap and officially declare Red, who finished 2nd, the winner. End, though dead, is the victim of a gross injustice, we naturally think. Motivating example 3. Suppose that after Mrs. Tisdale's death, her husband reveals all her secret vices because he has always hated her, perhaps with good reason, and wants the good reputation she enjoyed in her church to be demolished. This deliberate wrecking of Mrs. Tisdale's reputation constitutes an act of vengeance against her, so we may say that the dead can be attacked as well as wronged. Or maybe even that it's just a misfortune for Mrs. Tisdale that this is happening. Motivating example 4. Suppose that Mrs. Blue, now dead, was not in the least anti-Semitic, but that her spiteful neighbor now maliciously asserts that she was. This charge is a lie, and since it is a lie about a person who is now dead, it may be said to constitute a wrong perpetrated against a dead person. Her neighbor wrongs the dead Mrs. Blue when he falsely states that she was anti-Semitic. Motivating example 5. Consider, for example, 2 possible worlds. In World 1, a philosopher spends his entire life working on a metaphysical system that he believes to be and desperately wants to be the truth about reality. And it is. After his death, his system is universally accepted, endlessly discussed, and he is acclaimed as the greatest philosopher who ever lived. World 2 is exactly the same as World 1 up to the time of the philosopher's death. But in this world, a disgruntled neighbor burns the philosopher's house down the day after his death, and his writings are destroyed. We may imagine that he never revealed his metaphysical views to anyone, so his system is irretrievably lost, and the philosopher is remembered only by a few friends and the hostile neighbor. We would all, I think, judge that the philosopher's life in World 1 is better than his life in World 2, and think that the neighbor's vicious action in World 2 really harms the philosopher. What would be more natural than to feel sorry for the dead thinker? The labor of a lifetime, that for which he has sacrificed everything, all reduced to a heap of ashes. Poor man. These examples are plausible on their own, but sometimes it helps to look at things from a direction that is different from our initial head-on direction in order to see what it is that's driving our intuition. So ask yourself, in all of the cases that we just looked at, would it have been better had the apparent wrong or harm not occurred? Would it have been better had Bill Brown kept his promise to his dying father? Would it have been better had the initial panel of corrupt judges not stripped end of his title? Would it have been better if the disgruntled neighbor had not burned down the philosopher's house? It seems obvious that the answer is yes, it would have been better had these things not happened. But better in what way? It's not as though the world was made worse off by these things happening, so it's not better for the world. It would have been better, we might think, for the dead person. But if it would have been better for a dead person if something had not occurred, then that thing was a misfortune or a wrong or a harm for that dead person. It can sometimes be easy to get lost in the tangle of beliefs and intuitions that surround a conceptually difficult issue like death. So let's ask ourselves this. When we talk about the dead, as we're doing in this lecture, what are we even talking about? Well, consider this sentence. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, was the 16th President of the United States, and was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. That sentence is true, and it's true because the things claimed of Abraham Lincoln actually happened to Abraham Lincoln. The sentence isn't talking about the corpse of Lincoln or whatever that corpse has since become. So it is possible, now, when Lincoln is dead, to say true things of the living Abraham Lincoln. Now, when we recognize that fact, that it's possible now for us to say true things of a dead person without talking about a corpse, that recognition gives us insight into how it is possible for the dead to be wronged or harmed. And this is exactly the way that Pitcher will go. Let's introduce two terms: post-mortem persons and ante-mortem persons. A post-mortem person is a person after their death, and an ante-mortem person is a person before their death. So right now, if you're listening to this lecture, you are an ante-mortem person. You're not dead. Post-mortem people, they can't be harmed, not only because they're corpses or something even less recognizably human, but because they aren't people at all anymore. Remember, the dead don't exist. Post-mortem people don't exist. According to Pitcher, then, since it's possible for us to harm a person after that person's death, the person who is harmed is not the post-mortem person, since it's not possible to harm something that doesn't exist, but is instead the ante-mortem person. So, for example, Bill Brown harms his living ante-mortem father by actions that he performs after his father has died. Just as we can talk of ante-mortem people after they've died, Pitcher thinks we can also harm ante-mortem people after they have died. Now, when we initially hear this, we think, well, that's strange. How is it possible that after a person's death we can harm the person before they died? So let's get a handle on what we think the actual problem is here. Why do we think that's strange that after a person has died, we can harm them before they died? Pitcher thinks that what has gone on here when we think this is strange is that we think that his account requires backward causation. He says, certainly the main obstacle to accepting the thesis that an ante-mortem person can be harmed after his death is the disturbing notion that it would involve backward causation. The idea that it must involve such a process, backward causation, rests on the wholly misleading picture of being harmed as a kind of alteration in one's metaphysical state. To see how misleading this picture is, just consider the following. Suppose that Mr. Black's son, Jack, is killed in an airplane crash many miles away. Given that his son's welfare is one of Black's strongest interests, the son's death harms Black. It's a great misfortune to him. There should be no temptation to think that his harming of Black requires instantaneous causation at a distance. The plane crash sending out infinitely rapid waves of horror, as it will, diminishing Black's metaphysical condition. If that idea is absurd, so is the idea that if the son's death should occur after Mr. Black's and should thus harm the ante-mortem Black after his death, it must do so by a process of backward causation. Backward causation here is a cause and effect relationship where the cause happens after the effect. The effect happens before the cause. Now, normally, when we think of cause and effect relationships, we think that something causes some effect that happens after it. And we think that mostly because of the picture of time that we have, where we think that time functions in a particular direction. If X causes Y, we generally think, then Y has to happen after X. Pitcher agrees. Causation only works in one direction. And since causation works in that way, if it's possible for some later event to affect some person before that event occurs, then it's not causation that is running the harming or the affecting or the bringing about of a misfortune for that person. So these events don't cause harm. They do harm, but it's not causation that's running here. And that's not all that absurd. When we recognize that we can say true things now about the past without causing anything in the past, we recognize that there are non-causation relationships that can run from the present to the past, or from the future to the present, and we don't need to say that causation is running in some weird direction. So clearly one of the issues that's important here is the issue of time, the issue of temporality. It's the ante-mortem person who is harmed by post-mortem events. Fine, you might say, but when? When is it that the ante-mortem person is harmed by events that will happen only after her death? Pitcher says this to us. On my view, the sense in which an ante-mortem person is harmed by an unfortunate event after his death is this. The occurrence of the event makes it true that during the time before the person's death, he was harmed. Harmed in that the unfortunate event was going to happen. If the event should not occur, the ante-mortem person would not have been so harmed. So the occurrence of the post-mortem event is responsible for the ante-mortem harm. We don't need to think that something like fatalism, that fate occurs, or that determinism is true here, that future events have to happen. It's just that. If after you are dead, some awful thing happens that is against your living interests, then right now, those living interests are harmed. Not harmed by backwards causation, but harmed in that they're against your interests. It's true that that thing that happens in the future is against your current interests, which is why you right now are harmed. So harm doesn't, for example, shoot backwards in time. That's absurd. If I am harmed by events that will occur after my death, then it's true now that I am harmed by those events. If this still sounds somewhat bizarre, odd, even crazy to you, then ask yourself why. What is it that sounds so strange here? If it's that you think that this picture requires backward causation, well, look at what Pitcher says about why it doesn't. We have good reason to think that things that happen after a person's death can be contrary to that person's interests. If that's what we mean by harm, something happening that's contrary to someone's interests, then isn't it clear that somebody can be harmed even after they're dead? Now let's extend what Pitcher is saying just a little bit further to the claim that the fact that the dead can be harmed is itself a harm, or that the fact that the dead can be harmed can help us understand perhaps why we think that death is a bad thing for the person who died. If the dead can be harmed, then it seems as though death, or being dead, is a substantial further harm to the person who dies. Why is that? Well, consider this. Part of the reason why you and I have not been harmed as much as we could possibly have been in our lives is because we were around to prevent these potential harms from occurring. So think about things that would have harmed you had you not prevented them from happening. However, when we're dead, any harms that occur to us will be things that we can't possibly prevent. We aren't around to prevent harms after we're dead. So, our ability to protect ourselves, as it were, from harm is entirely eliminated by our deaths. And it's not as though we can say here, but I don't care about that because I'll be dead, because it's not the post-mortem dead us who is harmed by the events after our deaths, but instead the ante-mortem living right now person who is harmed by these events. So your death is a harm for whom? For you right now as you are. In this lecture, we've looked at George Pitcher's at once very intuitive but also very surprising claim that events that happen after a person's death can harm that person. And we noted that Pitcher solves the apparent incongruity of the claim that the dead can be harmed even though the dead aren't around anymore and people who aren't around anymore can't be harmed by saying that who it is that's harmed is the person before their death. So events that happen after a person's death can harm the living before death person. The main obstacle, Pitcher thought, to accepting this view is misunderstanding what's going on here as a sort of backward causation. But things don't harm us only by causing things in us. Oftentimes, things harm us by just being contrary to our interests. Thus, causation isn't at play here. What's at play is whether something is against our interests. When we die, our interests can still be harmed. Hence, the living person can be harmed by events that occur after their death. We extended what Pitcher was saying to a claim that since dying, being dead, prevents you from protecting yourself against possible harms, that death can be a harm. Not a harm to you once you've died, but a harm to you now. The fact that you will die means that at some point you won't be able to protect yourself against harms. And you can't say, I'll be dead so I won't care, because the person who's harmed by post-death events is the living you right here, right now. Thank you.